I preach on this, I call it from pride to faith. Jesus uses this very example in Luke 4:27 to describe to the proud Jews how foreigners had become right with God in the Old Testament and how the Jews didn't believe. And that was a pretty good analogy in their day too. Now we're talking about Naaman. There have been two theories about Naaman. Some say it's from the Hebrew root pleasant. Others say it's from the Armenian root, meaning one of the gods of Aram or Syria. I'm not sure which it is. Notice there's 5 things said about this man. He was really some fella. Number 1, in verse 1, he was captain of the army. He was number 2 in power and prestige to the king. And we think the king of Syria here is Ben-Hadad II. In his early years, Ben-Hadad led the armies himself, but as he got older, I'm sure he decided he needed someone else to do that for him. Number 2, it says, he was a great man with his master, meaning he was a confidant, a right-hand man. Look at number 3, highly respected, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. Before I comment on that, look at number 4 and 5. The man was also a valiant warrior, and number 5, but he was a leper. 5 things about him. Now notice what it says that God had given victory to Syria. This is the implication that God was even in control of the national destiny of Syria, or Aram. I think that's true across the board. We realize that God is the one that brought Assyria, called the rod of his anger. God brought Babylon, whistled for them, and they came and served his purpose. And here's the idea that God had given victory to Syria. And so we see that God is not just the national God of Israel, he's the international God of all the nations, that God is the only God. And the implication is he's not limited to one nationality. I think that's so important. The word victory here is interesting. It's the Hebrew word saved, which here it means victory. And I think it's interesting. Some of us think that this maybe this military victory spoken of here have to do with some victories against Assyria. If you look at your map, Syria is backed up right against the headwaters of the Euphrates. Some would say in the time of Shalmaneser II. And so we have Jehoram, king of Israel, Ben-Hadad II in Syria, and Shalmaneser II in Assyria. Now notice it says he was a leper. Here is a man who had all the accoutrements of a lavish, wealthy, influential, powerful lifestyle. But the man was a leper. Everything he had simply meant nothing, because leprosy was a terrible social illness in its day. In the Bible, many kinds of problems are described under the rubric of leprosy. Mildew in a house, mildew in garments, psoriasis, dandruff, an oozing sore, and what we know today as leprosy. It was many kind of illnesses. It doesn't seem that Naaman had the kind of leprosy that would ostracize you from your family. People may have been afraid to catch it, but it wasn't the kind they were afraid to and put him off in a leper colony. He's still with his family, with his wife. He still goes in and helps and talks to the king. So it wasn't probably the modern kind of leprosy, but it wasn't a terribly debilitating skin disease. Now this leprosy was often thought of to be some kind of divine sickness. We see it back in the Pentateuch in Miriam getting leprosy. I believe it's about Numbers 12 when she gripes at Moses for marrying a Cushite woman. The reason I think it was divine illness is that leprosy, there was no known cure for these diseases, but sometimes cures naturally came to people, and they attribute this to the will of God, and so it came to have this theological connotation. One of the kings of Israel, Uzziah, remember in Isaiah 6, the year Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. He was judged by God and made a leper later on in his reign. So he was a leper. Now the Syrians had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel. It's obvious that we're in a time of some tension between the nation of Israel and the nation of Syria. They butt up against each other in the northern area of the 10 tribes. Some of this goes back to 1 Kings 22, where Ahab went and tried to take Ramoth-Gilead. It's a city in the Transjordan area, and of course the northern area of Gilead, that belonged to Syria, and Ahab was trying to gain it back. That's the kind of border clashes we're having during this period. And one of these raider parties captured a young Hebrew girl. Now you'd think she'd be bitter, gripey, but she shows marvelous faith here. She apparently had true affection for the people who she worked for, who owned her. And she is going to tell the mistress whom she served, wish that her husband would go talk to the man of God in Israel. Little girl in great faith, doesn't show bitterness at all. It reminds me a whole lot of Joseph in Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15, where he tells his brothers, it wasn't God who sold me. It wasn't you who sold me into slavery. It was God who brought me here to preserve life. After all of those years of working through, I'm sure, his great pain, he recognized that somehow the will of God was involved in this. And I think even this slave girl is going to recognize that God's going to use her. Here is a faithful young girl that's available to God even in terrible circumstances. Kind of reminds you of the first 6 chapters of Daniel too, doesn't it? Verse 3, and she said to her mistress, I wish my master were with the prophet, of course this is Elisha, who is in Samaria. We learn from 2 different places that possibly he had a home in Samaria at this time. In verse 9 it says he came to his doorway, implies a house door. You might want to see chapter 2 verse 25 and chapter 6 verse 19 for the prophet Elisha having a house in Samaria, which is of course the capital of the northern 10 tribes, built by Omri. Then he would cure him of leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, of course we're talking about the king of Assyria, Ben-Hadad II, Syria, Amram. And isn't it amazing this guy would go in and tell this king the words of a little slave girl? Isn't that unusual? But the king responded, and thus he spoke to the girl who is from Israel. Now, I think it's obvious here that they were looking for any straw. I feel that way about people who are sick in our day. They go to all these quack doctors, try all these remedies that don't seem to work, go to doctor or somebody trying to say, well, I can help you. That's the kind of thing we have here. He was desperate. Had all the things the world could provide and was not happy, was not at peace, was not content. And he's looking for that physical wholeness. You know, sometimes it amazes me we forget how valuable our health is. We can have everything and lose our health and enjoy nothing. I think Naaman recognized that. The king of Syria said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, that's a weight, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 change of clothes. Now these change of clothes would be like party dresses. We might think of sequence dresses, pearl dresses, gold threaded party clothes. In this day and time, they were considered the same as money. And so it was a large amount of money he was bringing. Apparently the king of Syria thought that he could kind of buy the prophet's cure. He was used to the way the prophets are dealt with in these countries. You pay them enough, you tell them what to do, they'll do it. And so he kind of thought he could either bribe this prophet or maybe intimidate this prophet by sending a large amount of chariot force with Naaman. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, And now, as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. Don't you know, Jehoram just croaked. He said, look at the next thing. Am I God that I can make alive? Here is a king that thinks he can order the prophet to heal him, and the prophet will. They're quite different in Israel. And it came about when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes. This is one of the several signs of mourning. Pulling out your hair, putting dust on your head, sitting on the floor, not combing your hair. These are different ways of mourning. So he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and make alive? Now this is an allusion to some of the things that God can do. Deuteronomy 32:39, 1 Samuel 2:6 are some of the allusions to this. But consider now and see that he is seeking a quarrel against me. Well, Jehoram thought that Ben-Hadad II was doing this just to start a war, a pretense for an invasion. And I think that's exactly what he thought because of their tense relationships through the year. But of course, that is not. And it came when Elisha, the man of God, heard the king of Israel had torn his clothes. He sent word to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. This kind of set the stage for chapter 6, where Elisha told the king of Israel everything the Syrians were planning. There is obviously a tension between Elisha and the king of Israel theologically. There's also a kind of a merging unity as their purposes are tried to do what God would have them to do. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. All his wealth was there. His military power was there. There he stood in all of his pride. And Elisha sent a messenger to him. Don't you know it just burned him? It was probably Gehazi, his servant. Didn't even come to the door himself. Sent this little messenger out, and the messenger said, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. Well, boy, that was kind of insulting, this proud Syrian general with all his wealth. The prophet didn't even come out himself. And then it's still about in the Jordan. The Jordan was about, 20 miles away from Samaria. It was a dirty river. As you know, the Jordan plunges about 2,000 feet and something like 80 miles. It's not very far at all. And so as it goes, it takes all the silt from the riverbed with it. It's really a muddy thing. And, of course, he lives up in Syria, and there are 2 beautiful rivers up there. He's going to mention them and see if I can find them. Yes, in verse 12, the Abana and the Pharpar. These are crystal clear rivers, have a rock riverbed bottom instead of the mud. He says, I'm supposed to dip in this dirty river to get clean? Didn't make much sense. Of course, it was to show it wasn't the water, it was the power of God. Now, he went away furious. By the way, before I leave that, I want to mention to you that this concept of clean and unclean must have been something that was universal and not just Israel. And Naaman was furious and went away and said, Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me, the prophet himself. Stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leprosy. A little magic here, huh? This word for wave his hand, now King James has strike, and it is a possibility, but it seems it's the same word used for a wave offering, to push something back and forth before the Lord. And so here he was expecting him to kind of come out and do a mirrors and light show for him, burn a little incense, throw a few sticks around, holler a little bit, place his hands on it. But that's not the way the prophet does it at all. And so he's just kind of mumbling to himself in verse 12 about the clean rivers in his home. He's going to come down here and wash in some muddy river. Turned and went away in rage in verse 12. He's just prideful as he could be. But in verse 13, his servants came to him. Notice they call him my father. That may be an affectionate title for a master. Maybe they were slaves, or maybe it's an affectionate title for their military commander. We're not sure. It says, if the prophet had told you to do some great and hard thing, wouldn't you have done it? Why not do this easy thing and see if it's going to work? So look at verse 14. So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan. Did you see this? Went under once. Leprosy's still there. Twice. 3 times. 4 times. 5 times. 6 times. Still there. 7 times. Skin is new like a baby skin. Young boy skin. That was a test of faith, wasn't it? Yeah, the healing didn't gradually come. It came. Now, was there healing properties in the Jordan River that did that? Croak, no. It's the power of God. It's the word of the Lord. He recognized that. Changed his life. Look at this. And he was clean. And he returned to the man of God. And this is kind of shows respect and thankfulness. He came back and said to him, with all his company, and he came and stood before him and said, Behold, now I know there is no God in all the earth but Israel. My, what a statement of monotheism. Notice he doesn't thank the prophet. He thanks the prophet's God. I like that. The New Testament says they'll see our good works, glorify our Father in heaven. Yeah, it's focusing on God, not on Elisha. Now, there is no other God in all the earth. Man, what a tremendous statement. This guy comes out of a polytheistic background. We're not sure exactly how many gods there were in the Syrian pantheon, but there were several. Here is a man who comes from a polytheistic background, coming to the place where he affirms the uniqueness and the oneness and the universalness of Yahweh. He's in a country where the people are mixing Baalism and Yahwehism and not even seeing the difference. Oh, this foreigner has much greater insight than most of the Hebrews that Elisha deals with. Boy, tremendous statement. So please take a present from your servant now. But he said, Elisha, as the Lord lives. Now this is an oath formula, of course, from the covenant name for God, YHWH, from the Hebrew verb to be. As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing. And, of course, Naaman urged him, please, but he refused. And Naaman said, if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth. Now, what's that all about? Well, if you notice, the next he's going to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice. Now, this burnt offering is something that's totally burnt on an altar. And this sacrifice is kind of like a communal meal. You burn part on the altar, and then you eat the rest of the meat symbolically with the God you're worshiping. But why the 2 loads of dirt? Well, there's an implication in the ancient world that these gods are connected to nations. Ra with Egypt, Milcom with Moab, Bel, Marduk, Babylon, Rimmon or Hadad, Syria. So he's saying, let me have a little dirt from this land that I can worship your God on. That may be the idea. Of course, this whole chapter asserts that God is the God of all nations. He's controlling Syria's fate, controlling Israel's fate. God is a God of the universe. In this matter, may the Lord, Yahweh, pardon your servant. Now, this term pardon is a Hebrew term that's only used for God's forgiveness of man. Very important. Then my master goes into the house of Rimmon. Now, Rimmon, the Jews, they always stick the wrong vowels in the names for these gods. Is their way of making fun of them. We're not sure exactly the vowels that should be here. Some say this is the Assyrian storm god, because the word Rimmon, if you change the vowels, means thunder. Others say it's the high god, most high god, from the name for being most high or lifted up. And so it would be very similar or parallel to Hadad. Matter of fact, in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 11, it puts these 2 names together, Hadad, Rimmon, which shows they like when you have a name, Joel, Yahweh, and Elohim put together. So I think it's probably another name for Ben-Hadad. And this would have been identified in their day with the Baals of Phoenicia. So it's a fertility god, okay? And he's telling Elisha that he's going to have to, as a regular part of his serving the king, as a regular part of his state duties, he's going to have to go into the house of Rimmon to worship there. And he leans on my hand, meaning I'm right next to the king, and the king takes my arm when he kneels or whatever he does. And I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. That is a tough question. Can you build theology on verse 18? Does that mean if you get stuck, can you be a hidden Christian and go ahead and worship Allah or worship some other god just to get out of being killed or being hurt or losing some business? Woo! I think you can extrapolate much too much theology from this. The prophet does not even answer the question. In verse 19 he says, go in peace. You kind of get the gist of it. He's saying, God will take care of it, trust him. Or I can't answer that for you, just walk in the best light you have with the Lord. I don't think we can build theology on 18. I don't think we can compromise our faith in God. I think at best this is God's love that's willing to work in this man and his newfound faith. This man seems very sincere, but he doesn't want to jeopardize his entire career, maybe even his own life, by rejecting the national god of Syria. He's number 2 in command. And so I don't think we can build a precedent here, but I do think it shows some of the flexibility of God in working with new believers. Now, but Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, thought, behold, my master has spared this Naaman, the Syrian, by not receiving from his hands what he brought. As the Lord lives. Now here's an oath in an improper place. He's going to swear that he's going to do what he knows is wrong. He's going to take advantage of this Syrian in God's name. Think this Syrian ought to pay up, this old polytheist. I will run after him and take something from him. Now you know you've got to be kind of dumb to think you can trick a prophet of God. This prophet knows what's happening around him, and his servant doesn't know that well enough to know you can't trick him. Maybe it's just when greed gets a hold of you, it blinds everything else. And he, let's see. So Gehazi pursued Naaman. When Naaman saw one running after him, He came down from his chariot to meet him and said, "Is it well?" Now, don't you catch the difference in this prideful man that stood in all his pomp and power earlier? Now he hops off that chariot, the sign of Gehazi, the servant of Elisha. Well, this man's changed. Yes, indeed, this man's changed. He's worried about, is there a problem? And Gehazi said, "All is well. My master has sent me, saying, Behold now, 2 young men of the sons of the prophets." Now, he's lying like a dog. They're not 2 young men coming. It's a story to get what he wants. But it does show us this. During the period of Elisha and Elijah, I think going back to the days of Samuel, there were prophetic guilds or prophetic groups. They weren't so much connected with the king of the north or the south, but they were like roving bands of prophets, God's men kind of out away from the king. There were king's prophets, but there was also this guild. Here's what would be one of the sons of the prophets, meaning part of that guild had come and needed help. From the hill country of Ephraim, please give them a talent of silver and 2 change of clothes. They had physical needs. You could help them. And Naaman said, "Be pleased, take 2 talents." He said, "Here, boy, just take 2 of them, not 1. Urged him and bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothes and gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them before him. When they came to the hill, now that has caused some consternation among commentators. It seems to be very definite in Hebrew, the hill. Now literally it's Ophel, O-P-H-E-L. The King James has tower. The New English Bible has citadel. The Revised Standard Version has hill, like my New American Standard, and the Septuagint has park place. So we don't really know what it is. Apparently it was some kind of house. Before they topped the hill where the prophet was, he's going to try to stash the goods, if you please. He took them there from their hand and deposited them in the house and sent them away, and they departed. So Elisha wouldn't see him. And then he said, but he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said to him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" And he said, "Your servant went nowhere." Lying. And Elisha said to him, "Did not my heart go with you?" Now literally, did not my heart go? Meaning the heart was the center of the emotions, the center of the person, knowledge. Was not I there with you, he's saying? Did not I know where you went and what you were doing? Did not I perceive your feelings and your schemes? Gehazi, I'm a prophet. I understand what you did. Is it a time to receive money and receive clothes and olive yards and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female servants? These earthly kind of possessions that Naaman had and didn't make him happy. Now Gehazi wants these worldly possessions. Some commentators even say that with these talents of silver and change of clothes, he could have bought some olive vineyards and olive yards and vineyards, sheep and oxen and servants. I don't think that's the thrust, that he could have bought all this. The thrust seems to be, are you focusing on physical things? Has greed so captured your heart? You saw this man who had everything and wasn't happy. Gehazi, you're looking for happiness in things instead of in serving God. Boy, do we need to hear that in a materialistic culture. Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cleave. This is the same word as Genesis 2:14 about leave father and mother and cleave unto your wife. It's the word glue. Glue to you and to your descendants forever. Oh my. We're not even sure this prophet was married. But it's one of these 10 Commandment curses. Exodus 20 verse 5. The sins of the father of Israel to the 3rd and 4th generation. Some have said it's somehow connected in some way with the idea that Gehazi was a symbol of the entire Jewish nation that was searching for happiness in things apart from God. I'm not real sure exactly what it is. The Hebrew word olam, the word forever here, is an interesting word. You've got to interpret it in light of its context. It can mean for a period of appropriate time, or it can mean forever and ever to the ages. How long it means here, we're just not really sure. But the leprosy, the problem of the Syrian, the foreigner who believed, now went to the Jew who refused to trust in God. The Jew who was going to make his own way with his own resources. There's something of symbolism here, I think. that Jesus picks up on in Luke 4. So he went out from his presence as a leper, white as snow. And of course, white as snow is one of the characteristics of this disease. It turns your body bright white. And of course, what we have here is a transfer of illness from the believing foreigner to a, quote, believing Jew, who really was just believing in himself and what he could get out of life. And I think we ought to see something here about the modern manipulation of money. Sometimes it bothers me what I see on television, here on radio, about the manipulation of people with Madison Avenue schemes to raise funds. God help us. We're back in the Gehazi kind of mentality. God will provide what we need. God's all we need to trust in. So I think that's extremely interesting. If I was you, I would focus most of this lesson on the tremendous faith of this foreigner, which is going to be an example Jesus uses. And also, I think verse 18 must be explored in depth. You're going to do some commentary work on that and see what you believe about that, about this compromising or being a hidden Christian. I think the very heart of this lesson is how do you deal with verse 18. And I think this deal of materialism is certainly a great word for our day. We're more like Gehazi than we are, I think, Naaman. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. God bless you.